Hello and welcome to another episode of Lasting Transformation with me, Alan Parry, the author of How to Remove Trauma Response, Memory Reconsolidation Guidebook for Therapists and Coaches. What I want to look at in this episode is something that's come up quite a lot really in the last couple of weeks inside of the Memory Reconsolidation Coaching Academy. And it's something that's been raised on our coaching hub, like on our community forum. It's something that's come up in our live calls and also in private conversations as well between myself and some other members. And it's this idea, I suppose, that the best way I can really the umbrella term I could place over it is this sense of talking some sense into our clients. And it's that impulse that we can sometimes have to notice that the way a client is thinking about something might be unhelpful. Or depending on what your training is, there are some approaches of therapy which are focused on the ideas of our clients being irrational, that some of their thoughts are irrational. And so especially if you've got that kind of training, even the training itself will kind of nudge us into labeling something as irrational. And if it's irrational, then it makes sense to talk some sense into somebody. And so what I'm going to be looking at today is that impulse, which might just come naturally, which might be something which is a product of our training. And look at what is a better way of working with clients than having that emphasis of trying to talk sense into them, really at any point within your sessions. So there's three main things that I want to talk about in relation to this. I want to talk about that impulse to talk sense, how it shows up, what are the situations, just so you can recognize what I'm talking about. I then want to talk about why that's flawed, because there's a really important reason why that whole impulse is flawed and kind of gets in the way. And then finally, I want to talk about what is best to do instead. And so you're not just left here with a sense of, oh, well, that's flawed. But I'm going to show you a much more effective way of helping the client update those kind of beliefs that may well be getting in the way. So first of all, let's look at what that impulse actually looks like itself. So when we want to talk sense into a client, what's normally showing up is that the client is sharing some of their thinking, and it's clear that that thinking is getting in the way of life. It's clear that that way of holding an idea about something is stopping them from getting the very thing that they want. So I don't know, a client might show up with self-loathing, and you might think, well, but that's not true, is it? You're not this awful thing. And so you'll have this sense of, but that's not true, is it? That's a limited sense of yourself. And so the impulse might arise in you to try and talk some sense into them, to try and take that opposite stance, to almost debate them, or at least try and get them to see that that's not true. Or maybe they come up with something and they'll say that it's difficult for them to move forward because they feel a lot of guilt. And then you might have a discussion around guilt and how useful is the concept of guilt. And that might be another example. Or somebody might say, I never mingle at parties. And then the talking some sense into the client might be, but look how much better it would be if you did. Look at all the opportunities for friendship and connection and other things that might come as a result of mingling at parties. And so you can see there's always lots of opportunities within any session whereby the impulse to, quote, talk some sense into the client might arise. And as I said at the top of the episode, this will be particularly so if your training is basically got you to think about clients as if they're having thoughts that are irrational. Now, one of the things that it sometimes reminds me of, and I played this sometimes to therapists and coaches that I work with, because it's quite a funny sketch and it also underlines a way of working which is less helpful. So I don't know if any of you remember it. I grew up with this program, really, I suppose. And it was the Canadian comedian Bob Newhart used to have a show called Newhart. And if I'm right, I think he played a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. But there's this famous sketch called Stop It. And a client of his comes in and says, "Doctor, I've got this problem. I keep being frightened that I'm going to be buried in a box." And his advice is, stop it. And she's like, "What, just stop it?" And he says, "Yeah, you don't want to be living like that, do you?" And she says, "Well, no, it's awful." And he says, "Well, stop it." Now, when we're talking sense into clients, we're not quite saying that. But in some ways, what we're doing is, if Bob Newhart's character had gone on and started to give the justifications as to why his client should stop it, we probably hear some of those talking sense into the client type approaches where he'd start to justify why it didn't make sense for her to carry on and what would be better instead. So now that you might recognize where this is showing up, where the client says something and it just feels so limited and life denying and such a narrow way to think about a concept, or maybe that concept isn't even useful to them. Now that you understand that, let's get onto this sense of why it's flawed. Why the whole idea of talking sense into the client is a flawed one. And the core reason why it's flawed is that you don't need to talk sense into the client because their problem already makes sense. That this is not actually something that is irrational. This is something that makes absolute sense from the vantage point of their emotional learning. And so this is a really key concept shift. And we talk about this a lot within the Memory Reconsolidation Coaching Academy. This is a concept shift that's needed for transformational work to understand and really get it into your bones that every problem, no matter how strange it might look, that the client has, will on some level make a great deal of sense. Now, with reconsolidation, what we're actually doing is updating old emotional learnings, old emotional truths. Some of them will be trauma responses, but not just those, not just limited to those. And so in order to update those emotional learnings, in order to update those emotional truths, we have to take a stance that they make sense, because we have to really help the client understand what's really driving this. What is the old emotional learning that is propagating the problem, that is keeping the problem alive? Now, in terms of that emotional learning, let's say we were to go all the way back through history, their history, to find out when this first showed up. And you apply that to that exact circumstance, that exact situation. Nobody would then look at that and say that that emotional learning doesn't make sense. So I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody is growing up as a little child and they're in a household where, let's say one of their parents, let's say it's dad in this instance, and let's say any time that the child makes too much of a sound. It might be laughter, it might be play, the kind of innocent sounds that children make. Maybe the father in this instance really clamps down on them, shouts at them, rebukes them, maybe even worse, hits them. Doesn't it make sense for that child to learn that unless I keep quiet, something bad will happen? Doesn't it make sense for that child to learn that safety is more likely to come from silence? So if we take an emotional learning like that, which might still be playing out in adult life, we can't sort of we can't start from a standpoint of this is irrational. We have to stand from a standpoint of this makes perfect sense. Now, it might be outdated, but nonetheless, it makes sense, doesn't it? And so that's one of the big flaws in the whole concept of talking sense into someone, because it kind of assumes that it doesn't make sense already. And of course, it does. Whenever I'm working with a client, whenever the people inside the Memory Reconsolidation Coaching Academy are working with their clients, they always take that stance that this makes sense. Let's discover how. You see, the roadmap for transformation, to giving the brain what it needs in order to trigger memory reconsolidation, is in 3 steps. First, you identify the problem that you're working with real clarity. The final step is that you actually do the reconsolidation, that you create some sort of mismatch experience repeatedly that gives the brain what it needs. But that middle step, the middle step is all about discovery. And discovery is all about finding the worldview of the part that has this emotional learning that is keeping the problem alive. And if you start from a place of, well, that's just irrational, you're more likely to miss it. Even if you're not starting from a place of that's irrational, but your focus is on trying to educate the client on the limitations of that worldview, you're still robbing yourself of that journey and the client of that journey of actually doing the discovery and really discovering why it makes sense. Now, you might notice that it's actually less work this way. It's actually much, much less work because you're not involved in that butting heads where you're trying to say to the client, well, come on, this isn't true, is it? But every fiber of their being tells them that it is true. Every fiber of their being from their emotional learning feels that this is absolutely true. And when you look at that example earlier on about the child who made innocent, playful, childlike noises, laughter, play, and would be rebuked and admonished and maybe beaten for it, you can't really talk to the part that knows that that's true to keep the client safe from a standpoint of this doesn't make sense, because from that part, it does. So here's what I think we should be doing instead. This is what's going to be much more effective. Instead of trying to talk sense into the client, we can actually drop that. Drop all that butting heads labor that we're doing. And instead, we can focus on something else entirely. So here's the model I tend to use. And I teach this a lot inside the Coaching Academy. It's a core part of what we learn and what we apply and put into practice in our sessions. And it's basically the idea of the invisible twin. So the invisible twins idea comes from the sense that when a client comes to you for help, they're also bringing with them an invisible twin. I call it an invisible twin because it's not always apparent to the client from the get-go, but they'll basically come in with a very clear stance and they'll say, look, This is what's happening. I don't want this to happen anymore. I want that instead. But the invisible twin is their internal opposition to that. The invisible twin is the very reason why change has been difficult in this situation, because the invisible twin says, listen, you might want that, but my emotional truth knows that if I let you no longer have this problem and get what you want instead, you're actually going to swap this problem for an even worse one. So let's take that example that we've used within this episode. Let's say that child were to suddenly drop the idea that safety comes from silence, and so continues to play and laughs whenever they feel like laughing, or as big as they happen to be, as loud as they happen to be. We can see here that from that invisible twin's point of view, that's absolutely not safe. It's absolutely not the way to go. So when the client walks in and says, oh, I just want to be as big and as loud as I happen to be. I want to be able to laugh and be playful and not shrink into myself anymore. The invisible twin is the part that learned all those years ago that actually this is not safe. And if you were to start doing those things that you're wanting to do, then wow, it's only going to get much, much worse. That this problem might be difficult, but the problem that you'll get in its place will be much, much worse. And so once we understand that that's what keeps problems alive, then it follows that our focus for change is on that invisible twin. So when we're talking sense into a client, what we're actually doing is really nurturing the part of them that already wants change. But we're not updating the part of them, the invisible twin, that doesn't want change. So it actually switches our focus. It's not just hard work. It actually switches our focus onto entirely the wrong aspect. Because there's many things that we could focus on in therapy. We could focus on the part of the client what wants change. We could focus deeply on the problem. We could focus on their willpower in order to power through and get the goal, the outcome that they want. But it's always going to be effortful, because you're always going to be battling the invisible twin. And while the invisible twin thinks and believes and knows that that change is going to be so detrimental, the client will have their entire nervous system to wrestle, because it will be pushing them in the other way. And so you can see here that that emphasis away from the invisible twin actually misses where transformational work is going to happen. And by trying to talk some sense into the invisible twin, it will reject it, because from its standpoint, it's had the experience of knowing that it's true, that you should be silent, that it's worse if you're actually as loud as you happen to be. And so this is a common mistake. It puts our focus on the wrong target when it comes to transformational change. And all of those things can bring improvement, sure, but we're talking about transformation. We're talking about triggering the only brain mechanism that we know about that is capable of completely updating and functionally removing that old emotional learning. Because it's only when that invisible twin stands down that the change becomes easy. But the invisible twin won't stand down unless reconsolidation has happened. Now, in order to get reconsolidation to happen, you have to activate the old emotional learning first. But like I said in the last section, if our aim is to talk sense into the client and we rob ourselves of the discovery journey itself, we don't even actually have the emotional truth to be activated in the first place. And so we've already defeated ourselves. But the second thing that the brain needs is not just for the old emotional learning to be activated, but for there to be mismatch experiences. And mismatch experiences is what will trigger the opening of that brain pathway so it's able to be rewritten, and then bumping the activation of the mismatch together is what actually completes it. But you can't have a mismatch experience which is deliberate and focused and consistent and reliable, because unless you know what you're mismatching, it can't mismatch. It's like giving me a key to a lock on a front door and I don't know where the front door is. Just trying that lock on any old key is not going to work. So the discovery stage is crucial. The taking that stance of this makes sense is crucial. And what actually makes the change is not that hard labor job that we do of trying to talk sense into a very resistant, for good reason, invisible twin. What makes the change instead is that mismatch experience. So one of our members, Oogie, put this wonderfully on our live coaching call, because what he said was that his big insight is that the thing that actually makes the change is the mismatch experience, that it's not down to us to persuade the client of anything, because it's that mismatch experience, the memory reconsolidation, that does all of the persuading. It's the mismatch experience and the memory reconsolidation that comes from it that makes that transformation. And we don't have to butt heads. We don't have to make the case. We can let the mismatch experience do that work for us. And it was a wonderful insight that he came up with during that coaching call. And so as you can see, the best approach is not to talk sense into your clients because it already makes sense. The best approach is to find the invisible twins worldview and then deliver the mismatch. And as Oogie shared on our call, that's what the brain actually needs. And so the brain itself will do all of that heavy lifting for you. So let's just have a quick recap. First of all, we've looked at this impulse to try and talk sense into our clients. We see that something is really limited way of thinking about something, or if our training tells us it's irrational, we might think that, or even if it doesn't, we might just notice something where it's getting in the way of our clients' lives. And so we have this impulse to do a Bob Newhart and say, stop it, or at least give some of the reasons underneath that in order to try and talk a bit of sense into our clients. But we've also seen that that is a flawed approach and a very labor-intensive approach as well. You're doing a lot of work for something that's flawed because it already makes sense. You can't talk sense into something that makes more sense than what you're saying. No matter how much I would try to talk sense into a client who has had that experience that silence brings safety and that safety comes from silence, so I can't possibly be loud. No amount of my talking sense into them and persuading them is going to change that emotional truth. And I call it emotional truth because it really was true, wasn't it? When this learning was formed, it wasn't just true, it was absolutely essential. And so this part, the invisible twin that is keeping this problem alive, still believes it to be essential. And no amount of my talking sense, in inverted commas, into the client is going to do that persuasion for it, because it has a very different experience of it. And so the thing that we need to do instead is to actually focus on that invisible twin, assume that it has a worldview that makes sense, assume that it's creating this problem for some good, sensible reason, find out what that emotional truth is, because that is the agent of change. The invisible twin standing down is the agent of change. finding out its worldview and providing mismatch experiences is the agent of change. And as we heard from Oogie, that is where the persuasion happens. In the mismatch, not in our verbal persuasion, not in our attempts to see a concept, to have them see a concept differently, but simply to say, okay, this problem makes sense. We don't know how yet. Let's step into the discovery stage. We'll find out what the emotional truth of this invisible twin is. We'll keep our focus always on the invisible twin, because when it steps down, the change will happen automatically. And we will let the brain mechanism of memory reconsolidation do all the work of persuading for us. Because when they have that mismatch experience repeatedly, we know that what happens then is that memory reconsolidation is triggered. And when that happens, it functionally erases the old emotional truth. So it doesn't feel true anymore. Now, if you're interested in this way of working, it's a very different way of working that is really informed by this wonderful neuroscience breakthrough that our brains actually can transform in this way, that it can actually erase and update old emotional learnings, whether that be trauma response or whether it be something else. And if you want to work in this way, you might be interested in the Memory Reconsolidation Coaching Academy. And you'll be able to find more details of that at freshtherapists.com/coaching. I'll put the link in the show notes as well. If you want to find out any of the other stuff that's available from Fresh Therapists, you can go to freshtherapists.com. And if you'd like to work with me one-to-one, either for your professional development or your personal development, then you can go to alanparry.com. That's A-L-U-N, because it's spelled slightly differently, the Welsh way, A-L-U-N, parry.com. So I hope this has been useful. I hope that you can go into your next session with a little bit more ease and a sense of, thank goodness I don't have to do the persuading here. I don't have to talk sense into the client. I can just follow this roadmap to reconsolidation and keep the focus on the invisible twin and know that it already makes sense, and then look to provide the kind of mismatch experiences that will trigger memory reconsolidation. And like I say, that's what we focus on getting great at inside the Memory Reconsolidation Coaching Academy. So if that sounds like for you, maybe you'd like to join us. So that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and I will see you on the next one.